Good evening. Thank you guys for coming out tonight. This is the first night of our suicide awareness series, Understanding the Why. My name is Tammy Flippin. I work at the Library Center for the Springfield-Greene County Library District. I'm a reference librarian there and do grant research and funding. And this is a topic that's been near and dear to my heart, and we brought a group of people together to try and bring some more information to our community and try and help out families, friends, loved ones, everybody that we can think of, and try and attack what's going on in our community, because things are getting serious, and whether we want to, it's uncomfortable and it's hard to talk about, but we really, really need to, and that's what we're here for tonight. So this is our very first night. We've got a great panel. John Mooney from the Greene County Health Department is going to be our facilitator, and I will turn this over to him tonight.
Thank you, Tammy. So, good evening to everybody. So, there's a couple of things that I want to run through real quickly. One, if you see any of the panelists up here using their phone, I promise they're not texting or tweeting or Facebook Living anything. A few of them have their notes on their phone. But tonight, really, the goal of these three sessions really here is to help the community discuss the suicide crisis openly, without judgment, shame, stigma, or guilt. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish with these three sessions. And if you're not aware, this is a three-part series. So there's one this week that really focuses on the big picture. Next week is on solutions. And then the final week is grief. And so those are the three topics that we'll be really kind of trying to unpack over the next couple of weeks. And each week we'll have a different set of panelists. So if you don't like me, I unfortunately am the only one that you're stuck with for the next 3 weeks. So I will always try to wear some fun socks. So if you get bored with what I'm saying, stare at my socks. The format that we'll have for each of the sessions will be, we'll have a series of questions for our panelists each night. And then really what we want to be able to do is allow a lot of time for audience questions, because we really want to know, what do you guys want to know about more, what questions do you have, and we really want to try to have that engagement. So Tammy passed out those cards, or you would have gotten a card as you come in. Please, any question you have, write it down on there. We won't be able to figure out who anyone is, so don't feel like you can't ask any question. Before we jump into the questions and introductions, I want to just provide a little bit of background on this. So I am a public health guy, which means I'm a dork, and I love data, so I kind of always have to bring data to the party. That's sometimes the only thing I bring to the party. So we're in National Suicide Prevention Month, right? And Springfield-Greene County Health Department, I'm part of the Springfield-Greene County Health Department, Springfield-Greene County Library System, along with the partners Borough Behavioral Health and NAMI of Southwest Missouri, are the ones that have really pulled this together, and they have to be commended for that, because it's an important topic to talk about, and I appreciate their leadership in doing that. But as we look at the data, if we look at Missouri, since 2000, suicide has increased 36%. And we were talking right before, that's not a great number anywhere, and when you look at how we compare the nation, it's not favorable. So it's something that everyone deals with in the nation. Missouri is especially suffering from it. When we narrow down and we look more at just our community here, Greene County, in a 3-year period, we saw an increase of 66%. So in a 3-year period, we saw a 66% jump in suicides. And then if we look even a little bit deeper and we look at high school students, and so there's kind of two stories to this data point. So one, 18% of students this year reported that they had seriously considered suicide. And of those, 12% had made a plan. And so on one hand, that just breaks my heart to hear, right? But on the other hand, just talking with some others that know the data a little bit more, those numbers have gone up, but suicide attempts in that same group have gone down. And so they're hoping that we're starting to turn that tide and starting to have more open conversation with kids and our high schoolers to be able to have the conversation and actually talk to somebody about it. So I think that's a good, hopefully it's a promising step. And then the last thing that I want to leave you with before we jump into it is in a recent survey that was done by the Ozarks Health Commission across all of Southwest Missouri, 2,500 people responded. And when they were asked, what's the number one issue that your community needs to address, the number one answer, the most common response was mental health and substance use. So I think that's a promising thing, especially when you compare, people are putting that and prioritizing that over things like heart disease and cancer. So I think the community awareness is starting to recognize the importance of the topic, and it's events like this that I think push that even further. So I will stop rambling and we will jump into tonight's discussion here. So I'll go through and introduce our panelists and then we'll jump into our questions. So immediately to my right here is Tom Vandenberg. He is the Chief Forensic Investigator with the Greene County Medical Examiner's Office. He served there for 22 years as a death investigator. He received his master's degree in forensic science from the National University, and prior to his service as a medical examiner, he also served our community. Was it our community or other communities? Other communities.
Other communities.
Other communities as both a police officer and a paramedic. Next to him is Shelley Farnan. She's the Director of Diversity Enhancement and the Director of Clinical Training at Burrell Behavioral Health. In 2009, Shelley earned her doctorate of clinical psychology from Forrest Institute. She has extensive experience working with a variety of populations in evidence-based treatment and specializes in working with and advocating for diverse and underserved populations with a specific focus on serving the LGBTQ community. Dr. Farnan has a passion for building relationships, raising awareness, and facilitating change. Shelley believes change is always possible and that it starts in the small spaces. Next is Stephanie Appleby, who is 19.
I'm 19.
19, okay. We were discussing it before. So she is the Director of Marketing and Development with NAMI here in Southwest Missouri. She not only has a professional passion to support others with mental illness, she also has personal experiences with the disease. She's lost 5 family members to suicide and has lived with mental illness for decades. Through her treatment, NAMI has served as a key role, which has led her to volunteering and eventual employment with the organization. As the Director of Marketing and Development, Stephanie serves on a variety of roles to improve support and reduce stigma and barriers for people with mental illness. Earlier this year, Stephanie was also the keynote speaker at NAMI's Missouri annual meeting. And last but certainly not least, on the far end down there is Kurt Mattson. He's a licensed psychologist and coordinator of integrated behavioral health care at Cox Health. Kurt received his doctorate of clinical psychology also from the Forrest Institute. He's also recently completed his master's degree in business administration from Missouri State University. Dr. Mattson's practice emphasizes on risk assessment, addictions, and evaluating medical decision-making capacity. He also leads efforts at Cox Health to better integrate behavioral and medical care. Kurt also serves as adjunct faculty at Missouri State University. So before we go into questions, please help me give them a round of applause for volunteering their time tonight. Okay, so our first question is to let everyone kind of briefly introduce themselves and talk about both what do they do in their role at their organizations and then what really brings them here tonight. So we're just going to start here with you, Tom, and we'll walk down the aisle as we go.
Okay. As you heard, I am the Chief Forensic Investigator with the Greene County Medical Examiner's Office. Our office investigates all deaths outside of a medical care setting. So we investigate all deaths that we eventually will determine are suicide. I go to the scenes, I assist with the autopsies, and deal with the families after the fact, collect all the information we can because we don't want to make that decision lightly, but we base it on many factors before we make a determination of suicide.
Good evening. I'm Shelley Farnan, the Director of Diversity Enhancement at Burrell. First and foremost, though, a licensed psychologist, so I would say first and foremost, that's my passion. I believe I was brought here tonight as I specialize in working with the LGBTQ population, and as we get into the discussion, I think we'll find that we have a really high rate of suicide attempt and completed suicides with our LGBTQ population. And especially when we're talking about youth. And that might even be somebody that's just questioning their identity. So I came tonight hopefully to speak on behalf of this population, but also clinical psychologists first, just talking about suicide in general, some tips and tools of maybe easing some angst of, I think we can see in the room, it's awesome to see the number of people that are here, and it's really hard to talk about, so maybe how can we expand the conversation, help other people ease that anxiety of talking about it. So hopefully I can participate in that way in this discussion tonight.
So I feel like I need to clear the air. I am not 19. I'm 44. So thanks, John. My name is Stephanie Appleby, and I work for NAMI, but what led me to the organization, I was homebound for 14 years with agoraphobia. I did not leave my home at all for those 14 years. I had severe depression and anxiety, and also have 5 members of my family that completed suicide. So it was really scary for me to kind of come out and admit that I had this, because I thought my fate was pretty much sealed. I ended up doing a lot of research in those 14 years. It was hard for me to get resources to my home at that time. Thank God for the internet, because I figured out what was going on with me and felt like, okay, I'm not alone. This is an issue that a lot of people deal with. My goal when I got better was to work for an organization to help advocate for others like me, and the family members as well. It was very tough on my family. So that's what led me to NAMI, and I think that we've all felt a calling to this for a certain reason, and it's made us all very passionate about what we're doing. So there's been a lot of healing and helping, and NAMI has helped me tremendously with that. So.
I am Dr. Curtis Mattson, a psychologist with Cox Health, and really my role in the clinical aspect of the work that I do is helping with risk assessment, and I particularly work with a lot of addiction population in the hospital, and usually with risk assessment, it's after individuals come in with suicide attempts, suicidal ideation, kind of working with them while they're in the hospital and getting them set up with services and connected with community resources after that. I am moving towards a kind of larger and broader role with the system, and that is really, I think, where my passion is. The big thing that I like to focus on is reducing the stigma that is often associated with mental health, because I think it's that stigma that keeps a lot of people from opening the discussion that we're gonna open here tonight. And in that larger kind of broader role with the health system, it allows me to really direct kind of the form and function of our mental health services, how we then relate those services to our outpatient resources that we have in place, and really kind of hopefully go from what is and has been a very fragmented mental health system, not just here, but all across the country, to really setting plans in place to kind of create a more unified system that really takes care of people. And so that's kind of my passion now, is how we can reduce that stigma, how we can get people connected with the right services, and really open up this conversation to help people heal.
Great. So now that we've heard from each of you, sort of your perspective, what are you guys seeing in our community, really, with regards to suicide? What trends have you seen, whether that's feeding the public health guy data, or if that's just anecdotally, what are you guys seeing?
Well, we have had, like you said, an increase in youth suicides. In 2015, I believe we had 1. So far this year, we've had 6 under the age of 18. We had 2 in one weekend, but I know you see clusters of suicides in young people, but we never found any connection that they knew each other, different areas of the county, but just we're seeing a big increase in the young people numbers, and our numbers so far for this year are almost at what we ended up with last year.
Thanks, Tom. Others?
One thing that I would certainly add to that, so one of the things I work with right now is I help a lot of our outpatient clinics kind of triage and deal with when they get calls from people about wanting to talk to their doctor because their child or their parent or somebody that they know has been reporting suicidal ideation. And so I was out training a couple of triage nurses today at one of our clinics, and in the 45 minutes I was training them, we had 2 pediatric phone calls for parents calling because their children had talked about not wanting to be alive anymore. And so I think that to me is, even this morning, just had one of those kind of moments when it hit home, and it's like, man, we really have to take care of this. So that to me is kind of just emblematic of this problem.
I'm going to go back to our LGBT youth. We know that trans youth, or someone who feels like they were born into the wrong body, their brain tells them they're one thing, their body tells them they're somebody different. We know with those kiddos, they actually across the trans population, we know 50% of those individuals have attempted suicide. And if that sounds high, then I'll be generous and I'll say 40 to 50% of that population has attempted suicide. That in and of itself drives me to train and talk as much as possible, because it's not rocket science that ends up helping us reduce these rates. I know we'll get to that later, so I'll save that. But so for our trans population, 50% of that population reports attempting suicide. If we just talk about someone who's maybe questioning their identity or they're not quite sure, they're still in that figuring it out phase, they're 3 times as likely to attempt suicide. When we get into sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, bisexual, we know that this population is 4 times more likely to attempt suicide, and they're 4 to 6 times more likely to result in injury after they've attempted. And then if we get into, so a lot of this is about our family, our connections, our support systems, right? We know that about suicide, mental health, and wellness. When we talk about family systems, if a kiddo is reporting that their family is highly rejecting of who they are, their identity, those kids are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. And that's just because they don't feel like their family, it's not that they don't feel like, it's that their family is rejecting them. So when we're talking about rejection here, that's not abuse, that's not victimization that this population experiences, it's family rejection that leads to an 8 times higher rate of suicide attempt. So that's what I know with our LGBT youth.
Okay, thank you all. So I think one of the big things that we want to unpack, I think, and I have a feeling we're going to touch on this in each of the 3 sessions, is both stigma and then what are the myths out there about suicide? What are the things, the common misperceptions that we have and about suicide and what leads up to it in suicide itself? Again, we'll just open up for all panelists.
One of the things I hear most commonly from families of patients that I work with in the hospital is what I think is one of the biggest lies about suicide is they have so much to be happy about. Why are they sad? And I think sometimes we have a tendency to treat mental illness like there's an obvious one-to-one connection. And I think unless you've experienced any sort of mental illness and know the way that it kind of warps your thinking, the way that it warps your behavior, and just how alone a person can feel, I think it is extremely invalidating for a person to hear, you have so much to be happy about, why are you sad? I've never been in a situation where that just perked somebody up and all of a sudden they didn't feel that way anymore.
I think for me personally, before my suicide attempt, I had reached out several times and said, I'm feeling suicidal. I don't feel right. I don't feel good. And my family thought, she's just saying that. You know, people that say they're going to do it never do. So that's a common misconception that still bothers me today, because it takes a lot of strength and bravery to come forward and say, I'm feeling this way, and then for someone to kind of, you know, poo-poo it like, oh, she's not going to do it. That was something that really bothered me and still does.
Along those same lines, I think that, and we probably will reference this several times, but if we talk about it, it makes it happen more. We're planting a seed. They hadn't thought of it, and now we're talking about it, so it's going to happen more. There is no research to back that. What we find is by talking about it, we reduce the rates. It lets and I think this is what we're talking about, just maybe with expression in general. When we talk about it, it takes the energy out of it. Whenever we hide it or we cover it up, it just fuels that energy to do something with all of that, whatever it is. Sadness, worry, depression, it's different for all of us. But when we cover it up, it makes that worse. So talking about it does not lead to more suicide.
What about different groups? I mean, myths that we believe, you know, it only happens to this person. Like there is a poster child, if you will, for suicide. Does that exist, or is this something that affects everyone?
I think a lot of times people see what they want to see. And so I think the whole idea, and that's kind of what I hear a lot, like I said, in the hospital, would they have so much, to be happy about, why should they be sad? If that were the case, then, why do we know that mental illness, and why do we know that suicidal ideation and attempt, that it affects every socioeconomic class, every gender, every orientation, there's not a person that's not touched by this in some way. And so I don't think there is any sort of way to kind of parcel it out. I think sometimes people do that as a kind of creative way of thinking that another myth that it'll never happen to me or anyone in my family, which again is another thing that people will tell themselves.
And I think we learned that with the recent celebrity suicides that we've had. You look at them and think they have it all. And I remember when Robin Williams took his life, I remember thinking that's exactly how I feel. I will make a joke out of everything. I'm always, people think I'm funny. That was my mask. And I think he wore it well and opened a big door for a lot of people to step forward and say, hey, I'm dealing with this too. So, and you look at these celebrities that you think had it all. And ultimately, it doesn't matter when you feel that sick,
What about the misconception that it's a phase? I know I've heard people say that before. That's just a phase someone's going through. How do you respond to that?
I think just in life, kind of and probably now, listening to so many stories of people in the darkest of days, their deepest despair, I take everything that every person says seriously. So even if we feel like it's a phase, my working motto is if you say it, we're definitely going to look at that. It doesn't mean we're going to jump to conclusions or anything, but I want to know. My mentality is it's never a phase. If we're talking like that, there's something underneath it that we need to get to provide care. So it's just a phase is probably a statement that we just need to erase from our responses, from our discussions, because it's likely not just a phase. It is a tip for us to pay more attention.
Couldn't agree more. I've never heard of somebody going through a phase where they just woke up one morning and started talking about wishing they were dead. I've never heard that as a phase. I don't think there's any research to back that up. I think, again, that's a thing people say to kind of hope that it's something that they'll say will never happen in their life, but I've never heard of it as a phase.
And if I could say one more thing about that, let's really think about our own experiences with loved ones, with ourselves, with somebody that's close to us, or maybe just somebody that we've found on TV. We want it to just be a phase. So as the person that's listening, or the person that's the one person sitting there in that moment, we want it to be a phase because it scares the heck out of us. We don't know what to do. We feel helpless. It doesn't make sense to us. So I think a lot of times that it's just a phase is actually taking more care of the listener than it is the person that's expressing themselves.
Great. So I'm actually going to jump to a couple of questions here from the audience because they really just go right along with some of this that we've been talking about. So one of the questions here is, besides depression and bullying, what are some other common reasons why someone would progress down the road to suicide? And is there always a precursor? Because that's something I've read, more recently too, that not all individuals that attempt have sought medical care before or have been able to get help. So that's sort of maybe two different questions. One is getting help before, and one is what are some of the other reasons?
Well, from talking with families, many families say they never had any indication. We talked a minute ago. They've been happy. They had all this to look forward to. No indication. Have never mentioned it. And just, it's out of the blue. So a lot of completed suicides, everybody that I've talked to said they never would have suspected that. And it just comes out of the blue.
So, and my thought on this is that usually when we, in kind of going along with stigma and things, when we learn to be helpless, a lot of times I think that's what you see. When people start not feeling okay, they might be more willing to kind of talk about feeling off or feeling depressed. And what happens is if there's no response from the people around them that help take care of them, that watch out for them, their friends, their family, if we just treat it as, oh, it doesn't really matter, it's just a phase, right? We treat it like that. I think that's why what happens is they learn to quit reaching out. And so I think that's when we get a lot of the, we didn't see this coming. I would wonder, in those situations, how many signs before that event happened were missed by the people around them that didn't react to some of those earlier cues.
And we can, I'm a little bit hesitant because I do think there are things that maybe we see in research of this might be more likely to result in a suicide attempt or something like that. But even in answering that, I worry that we're going to say, oh, well, this person that said it doesn't have schizophrenia. They don't have bipolar disorder. They don't have a chronic and persistent or a chronic health issue. Those are the, bullying, victimization. Yes, and it could be something that we don't even know yet. So I think if we open the conversation to let's treat it like in hospitals, right? Blood, what's the approach to any, I can't think of it right now. I've been too far removed from the medical system, but anytime we approach somebody with a blood-related issue, we're going to put gloves on. What's that called? Anybody know?
Bloodborne pathogens.
Yeah, there's something that I'm looking for. It's like universal precautions. It's like universal precautions for mental health. Like, we are all susceptible. There's not probably any of us on this panel. Yes, there are indicators that might make us more likely, but any of us could end up completing suicide or attempting suicide. Now I've got myself on a rant that I forgot what I was going to say.
I think for me, what was really scary for me is it was a dirty secret to talk about mental illness in our family. It would have helped me a lot more to know our family history, just like we educate our family about, grandpa had diabetes or, grandma had heart disease. We need to be really conscious of the fact that if mental illness is in our family, you're not necessarily going to get it, but we need to know that. That's something that we need to educate our family about. And I think that for a long time it was a secret, and it did a lot of people a lot of disservice by not talking about it. I think we need to be aware that that's something that has ran in your family. But I can be wrong.
So I would say too, in doing the risk assessments that I do in the hospital system, I don't know that it is even appropriate to say that there is this grouping of things that is associated. We might have some issues that tend to be more associated or less, but there's a lot of things that are generally kind of risk factors for this type of incident. And I think the danger is trying to say, well, condition X, Y, and Z aren't present, so there's no way they would do anything like that. If they're telling you that there's a problem, we need to treat that as serious. And I think this kind of blends into one of my other kind of big passions about stigma is a lot of times we are not very careful with the words that we use. And, somebody has a bad day at work, or they, somebody cuts in line in front of them at the grocery store, and they're telling the story later, and it's always this crazy person who did this and this crazy person who called them on the phone. And then they have somebody who reaches out to them because they have a concern, and they say, well, that couldn't be them. They're not crazy. And we don't realize how we tie in the words that we use to describe everyday situations, how invalidating that sort of talk and that sort of speech is to people who are genuinely coming forward and expressing concerns. And I think, learning how to kind of manage the way that we talk to each other is important, but I think it's especially important in terms of how we identify and treat and help those people around us. What are the words that we're using that are invalidating to them when they try and tell us about what they're experiencing?
Great, thanks. So I'm going to put all of my questions on hold because we've got a bunch of questions now from the audience, so this is great. So we're going to back up for just a second, and there's a couple of questions around ages and who is most likely to end up attempting suicide. So the first is, what's the most common age of people who attempt suicide? Is there the most common age? Or maybe when does suicide ideation typically start?
Well, I don't know about a common age for suicidal ideation. I know I just went through our statistics here for Greene County, and I just picked out below 18 and then above 65. And then there's really not a specific age range in between. In 2015, we had 2 suicides that were below 18, and we had 7 that were over 65. 2 of those were in their 80s. In 2016, we only had 1 under 18 and 9 over 65, and 1 of those were in their 80s. In 2017, 5 were under 18 and 6 were over 65, and 4 of those were in their 80s. And so far this year, we've had 6 that were below 18 and 6 that were over 65, and of those 4 were in their 80s. And a lot of times the elderly, we are seeing health concerns or dealing with a spouse that they're no longer able to be a caretaker, or having to give up their independence in their site to move into an assisted living or some kind of a care facility. And that's a big factor for the elderly. But like I said, between those ranges, it's really just pretty evenly split between 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s.
And I think too, Tom, when we work on those reports, a lot of times we see a spike with males over females too.
Yeah.
So that's something, but women tend to have more attempts where males complete more often.
Yeah, and our completed suicides are largely male. We had, and I broke them down into the different categories, but for gunshot wounds, 33 or gunshot wounds, 29 are male, 4 are female, and overdoses are about equal. You always think that women will use pills, but overdoses in 2017, it was 5 and 5, males and females, for the overdoses. And we've always been taught women will never hang themselves or shoot themselves, but every year we have several in all of those categories.
We talk about resources here real quick. There is an American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that has fact sheets for each state, so I just pulled that up. And when I looked at this earlier, I was a bit shocked. Missouri ranks 13th in the nation for suicide rates. So per 100,000, we have 18.62 compared to the national average, which is 13.42. So I think beyond Springfield, Missouri, we have an issue that we definitely need to be talking more about. And so for Missouri, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. It's the 2nd leading cause of death for ages 15 to 34, the 4th leading cause of death for those of us 35 to 54, the 8th leading cause of death for ages 55 to 64, and the 16th cause of death for ages 65 and older.
And I think something else too that's important to point out is we lose more people to suicide in Missouri than we lose in car accidents. And that's a statistic that I use a lot to people don't realize, how many individuals we lose. We hear about car accidents on the news and stuff all the time and fatal accidents, but it's just alarming to me that we lose more people to suicide than we do car accidents.
But you don't see it on the news. Why do you think that is?
Because if we talk about it, it'll create more instances, right? Which is, again, a myth, definitely a myth.
Well, and I know from going to scenes that the media may show up And if you say it's a suicide, they will pack up and leave. They say they don't report on those. And it's a respect for the family, or, yeah, it's just, that's not something you talk about. So if the media shows up and we tell them it's a suicide or appears to be, then they will leave and it'll never be heard of again.
I don't have any other statistics other than those to add, but I can tell you in the hospital, in terms of kind of enacting our suicide precautions in the hospital, the youngest that we've done it on is 5, and the oldest has been 92 for me, at least personally. I don't know about the other providers I work with, but so I kind of going back to the question, I think all of this data and everything else just shows, again, another reason why we shouldn't treat it as, well, these things aren't present, so I don't need to worry about it. It's if somebody comes to you and there's an issue, we have to treat it as serious.
So, okay, we're going to, well, no, there's one or two more questions still on sort of what we see in different groups or populations that attempt. So one of them is can any of you speak to the prevalence or how often it occurs with first responders like police and fire?
I have had multiple retired police officers. I have known first responders who have taken their own life. So I don't know how prevalent it is, but there's very few years that go by that we don't have 1 or 2 retired officers.
And then the last question, I think, on this topic, unless others come in, is have you ever noticed that there's a higher percent for those who are unemployed? Or does it go back to it affects everyone?
I've never seen anything that points out that it affects people. I mean, these are all different kind of risk factors. We look at protective factors. We kind of look at a whole range of various things. But again, even as somebody who's kind of trained to help assess risk and identify need, there is never a situation where we would say that somebody is at no risk of suicidal ideation, just like we would never say somebody is at 100% risk. We always kind of have to hedge our bets a little bit because there's no perfect way of predicting. And I think because there is no perfect way to predict, it's because there are so many things that are risk factors that can contribute to that. So, and the other thing that I would add on top of that is not just risk factors, but a lot of people will judge risk factors subjectively, right? So you might look at it and think, well, they've got a great job. They might look at it and think, this is a job I don't want. And so people have a tendency, what we might perceive as one risk factor or the absence of a risk factor, they might actually perceive for them as being a risk factor. And if that creates distress, again, it's another reason why we need to be kind of paying attention.
And loss of a job is one of the things. We have a checklist to go down for possible factors when we look at a suicide. Loss of a job or retirement is another factor that some people, their job was their identity, and when they retire, no longer have that. I think that's where the law enforcement people really come into that. Their job is their identity. And we do see a lot of people that complete suicide that have had either a major financial or employment issue.
Well, and that leads us into a couple of questions here that's from the audience. So how common is it for someone who has completed suicide to have left a note or a reason? And the second part of that question is, when there is no note or clear reason, how do you determine that it is suicide?
I think that's a question for you, Tom.
That's what I deal with.
Yeah.
Maybe 30% of people will leave a note. I've had people leave books of writings and notes. I had a lady recently who had 3 sets of notes. She left one in the house, had one in her purse, and had another set in her pocket. And then we have people who will maybe just write a few words, and then the majority of people don't leave a note. And now with technology, a lot of people will send text messages, send emails. I've had a lot of that recently. So we try to look at telephones, we try to look at computers, and we look for anything that may be written. But we look at the situation, we look at the person's medical history, their psychiatric history. We talk to everybody we can that knew them, find out what's been going on in their life. Like I said, we have a checklist. It's about a page and a half of factors that we look at before we determine that a death is a suicide. Like I said, we don't want to take that lightly, and we certainly don't want to classify a death as a suicide that is not. But there are a lot of people who don't leave anything to tell what they were thinking or why they did it. And then we have others that will write out pages of why I did this and label it with bullet points and be very specific.
Thanks, Tom. So another question, so we're going to shift gears again here. Can you define mental illness, and what is the difference between illness and struggling to cope with life?
I'll let you take this one.
I don't think you can do that as a panelist.
I
Just volunteer
can speak
someone else.
Personally, for me, it was when it started interfering with everyday life for me. That's when I knew that it was an illness and not just something that I was going through. I can remember my first panic attack happened when I was dropping my daughter off at kindergarten. And I avoided that the next day. I didn't want to go through that car line. And then I had a panic attack at Walmart. Then I started avoiding Walmart. Eventually, my circle got so small, I was avoiding everything. And like I said, I was homebound for 14 years, and then I got to where I would only eat the same thing for 14 years, which I do not eat that stuff anymore. Dr. Matson, you can tell. But I was afraid that if I had a allergic reaction, I would have to leave my house and get treatment for it. So when it affected my everyday life is when I definitely knew I was in trouble.
Thanks, Stephanie.
That's a very deep question, so kudos to whoever wrote it. You know, a problem is a problem when it becomes a problem. And I think that's really kind of essentially what Stephanie was saying, is that as her circle became smaller, her life was more limited as a result. And I think we've all had challenges. We've all experienced times, work, family, school, whatever it was, and we're able to find that push through. And I think when we find that those times where we have that stress or that worry about it and we can't push through, or we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, we can't see that release of the anxiety when that situation's over, I think that's when we really start looking at kind of something more prevalent is there. But again, I mean, I think that's such a loose, probably unspecific definition of what constitutes mental illness, because it's so broad, and to be fair, there's still a lot about mental illness that we're still figuring out. And so, again, I think that's why it's important to, understand ourselves, but also be sensitive to understanding each other as well.
And when we think of, if I can break it down as simply as possible on how I view that, I think illness can be coping and vice versa. What makes the most sense, though, is when you hear the person's story. We are our own experts, and we know, as talking to someone this week, how is this different than any time before? And the person said to me, I've dealt with anxiety my whole life. I have never once thought of suicide, and in the past 2 weeks, I've wanted to take pills. I know this is different. I know what anxiety is. I know that this is different. So it's not me knowing textbooks, it's not me being an expert, it's me being willing to sit in the discomfort to hear a person's story and to understand their perspective of their own experience. And just because it doesn't fall under some category in a textbook or some statistic, which is what we're all saying, And that was how I was relating it earlier. Use universal precautions with every person you're working with because we're all susceptible.
So then if we look at our own lives or people in our lives, what should be that trigger that says, let's talk to somebody? Because, if I'm a layperson, I'm not equipped, right, to do the same services that you guys can do. What's that trigger? What's that tipping point?
Go ahead.
I'll just be short. If I'm not able to express it myself as an observer, I'm going to see something has changed, most likely. That could be, and it's not only just depression, down and out, sadness. That could be extra energy. That could be overexcitement. But it's different than a person's usual presentation that you've come to know. So there's some difference.
What I typically tell families and friends of patients that I'm working with is, if it's different enough to you that you know your friend or your family member isn't acting like your friend or your family member, then we've already reached that we're already past that tipping point of needing to do something to help intervene. I think going back to the myth question about what are some kind of myths about this, I think one of the myths is that, well, I'm not qualified to really intervene. And I think the big myth here is that we are all frontline interventionists in this particular field. Now, we're not talking about frontline treatment. We're not talking about psychiatric care or inpatient psychiatric care. But in terms of somebody who's willing to step forward and intervene, we are all of us are frontline interventionists in that standpoint. And so I would really like to encourage everyone, if something feels off to you, it is off. It's not off because you're just, you woke up on the wrong side of the bed. If your friend or family member is different and they're telling you they feel different, then it's time to really start asking them some questions and help them figure that out.
Okay, so we're going to keep going kind of further down that path. So one of the questions we have here is, if someone we know expresses suicidal ideation but does not want help, how do we push them to get professional help? How should we respond? There are no soft tosses tonight.
That's one of the toughest things is the secrecy. And I think that gets back to stigma. I think that gets back to fear. If I talk about it, then all these bad things are going to happen. I'm going to be hospitalized. And historically, that probably would have been the case. And sometimes that is the case. So if somebody tells me that they don't want help, I'm going to remind them how much I care about their well-being. And I'm going to say it's absolutely necessary that we seek help. So this could be my own family members, loved ones, friends. I care enough about you. I'm going to be in this with you. We're going to figure it out. And I'm going to be in it with you. And I wouldn't push. I wouldn't. So a lot of times what I see people saying is, well, they told me that they were going to reach out. Right. And I'm going to make sure that that person does reach out. I'm going to be in it with them because we can tell people a lot of things. We can hide, we can cover a lot of things up. Sometimes we need that supportive accountability to follow through.
I think that goes back to what you said too about language. When I had told my family, they had said to me, you absolutely are so sick and you have gotten to the point where you're just crazy. No one does this. No one stays in their house and is this afraid. You need help. We're going to take you to get help, and we're going to take you to the hospital, and you are not coming out until you're better. So for me, I felt like I had done something wrong. And a lot of times when we take some of our clients over to the hospital, it still feels that way. I mean, you go to the hospital, and there's a wooden box in a room with a mattress on it, and it's very bare and isolating, and you do feel like you've done something wrong. Obviously, that's for your safety, but at the same time, it is scary. It's a scary experience. So I think it goes back to what Dr. Mattson was saying about language. I mean, we have to be really cautious and come at it in a way where we're wanting to help and be supportive so that they'll want to get the help.
And I would certainly agree with that. And I think, and that's a word that drives me I just can't stand to hear it is when I have, somebody that says, well, I told my family how I was feeling, and they said, well, they'll say something like, well, that's crazy talk. Well, that person didn't wake up that morning and say, today's the day that I hope I feel like hurting myself. Like that's not how it happens. We're talking about a progression that kind of leads somebody down this kind of chain of thought. And so they already know that they've not been feeling like themselves. And when you reinforce that in a negative way, of course, that just continues that line of thinking. And so, again, I think it comes with, first, the idea that we are all here to intervene for our family and friends. And that starts with us being willing to listen and being able and willing to listen without judging what's happening, right? Just being available and in the moment. But the other thing, and I agree with what Dr. Farnan said, is that, if it takes me pulling out my cell phone and sitting there with the person and, calling a crisis intervention person and letting them talk to them and letting them kind of work through whether or not they have some crisis intervention space for them, or if it's a person who needs, help. There have been times when I'm a huge Mizzou fan. You don't know because I tried to hide it so that I wouldn't bias anybody. But so there was a time actually last year when I was up in Columbia, Missouri for a football game, and I happened to be checking Facebook as I was filling up the gas tank in Jefferson City, and a friend of mine back here in Springfield had posted that they were having, it was a very cryptically worded Facebook post that seemed to indicate they were endangered. So, even then, taking that step to call for a well-being check and then to follow up on Facebook to try and reach out to that person and find out what you can do to help, you can do that now with the connections that we have. And so, I would say that we need to be available and to be purposeful in how we talk to the people around us about that.
And I think it's important to mention, too, that when you do call, you can ask for a CIT officer, which is a crisis intervention team officer that's specifically trained to deal with people having mental health issues. So that's very helpful. We use that a lot, and they kind of de-escalate the situation. I know it's scary for some people to see a police officer walk in, but the CIT officers are trained so well that a lot of times they can talk them down from the situation and have them, laughing and wanting to go get the help. I think that our perception is still so primitive about what happens when you go over to the hospital, that you're going to be in a straitjacket, or that people are going to think you're crazy and not want to talk to you again. But we're really learning, I think, with law enforcement too, how to handle these situations, and people will be encouraged to ask for help next time.
And sorry, one other thing I would say real quick. I didn't mean to interrupt you, John, but
I had started.
Another thing that I would say to that is I would want to know why that person was feeling that way and didn't want to get help, because I think that in itself is a cry for help. And so the story that I normally get when I get responses like that, either from patients or even from friends when I've had to intervene, the number one thing that I hear is, well, I don't want to have to go to the institution. I don't want people to think I'm crazy. It's all wrapped up in this idea that they have about the stigma that's going to be associated with the treatment. And again, I think from a broad perspective, that's really where kind of this change and this grassroots change needs to come from in the way that we talk about and treat mental illness. If people knew and they understood that it was okay for them to get help, I wonder how many of those people would say that they want the help instead of that they don't want the help.
So, and you guys are just teeing up these questions perfectly, so thank you guys. Keep it up. So let's actually walk through that. What happens when someone goes to the hospital? And is it different for a child versus an adult?
You mean they're having suicidal ideation and they...
Well, let's both walk through suicide. If there's let's go with suicidal ideation.
Okay. So I can only speak to kind of some of the things that we do with Cox Health, although that I know a lot of these processes are probably pretty similar. But so if we have somebody who comes to Cox North and they're reporting suicidal ideation, or even Cox South, we're going to get them evaluated. So we have a psychiatric intervention team, and we do some evaluation through that process. And if they need to be admitted, then they'll be admitted into our inpatient psychiatric unit. We do have some people that come into the hospital at Cox South after they've had a suicide attempt, and we will make sure that they are medically stable before we work for any sort of treatment placement or anything like that. And we'll evaluate them in the hospital and then make recommendations for transfer after that. I don't know how far you want me to walk through the process.
How much further do you want to walk through the process?
How much time do we have?
Yeah.
So no. So I will say there's a lot of misconception about what inpatient psychiatric treatment is. And so, I can only speak to the programs we have at Cox North, but we offer individual treatment. We offer group treatment. We have psychiatrists that staff the floor. We do medication monitoring. And it's a very open kind of group. There's kind of like treatment areas, day treatment areas where it's not just everyone's in their room by themselves. In fact, the idea is we want people when they come out kind of where they sleep at night, when they come out for the day, we'd like them to be engaged enough in treatment that they're moving between kind of different treatments and different activities and things like that throughout the day enough that they don't need to go back into their own kind of room. We want them to feel comforted to be out. So I think treatment is different than a lot of people have experienced or that they've seen in movies or maybe heard about from other people. But at least the treatment programs we have at Cox North are very open. They're very inclusive. You get lots of opportunities for treatment. It's not scary at all. So it's very open and warm.
Okay, so staying on the medical setting, so one of our biggest professions in this community is medical, so I know that there have to be a handful of people, if not more than that work in the healthcare setting here. So for someone that is not trained in working with someone that has mental illness, how it's going to commonly come up. Mental illness and suicide ideation is commonly going to come up with patients. How should medical staff respond to that presentation from the patient?
These are good questions.
Does it depend? Depend on the different setting? Because I'm assuming different clinics will have different resources available.
Oftentimes we do see that folks go to their medical provider first. I mean, we do see that a lot. I mean, if it's not a loved one or family member, we think, I need to get to my doctor. And let's be honest, medical doctors are much more accessible than psychiatrists if we're thinking of needing treatment through medicine. So a lot of times we're going to see that. And while I'm just recently back to Springfield, I feel like there's been a ton of work being done in the area for better partnerships between our mental health systems and our medical systems, and I think that's where it has to start. We have to, instead of like being these separate entities, we have to look at the whole person, and to do that, we have to work together, mental health and the medical systems. Is my initial reaction to that.
So I'll absolutely agree with that. So one of the big pushes that we have right now with Cox Health is integrated behavioral health care, where we are trying to put trained behavioral health clinicians in primary care clinics. In fact, you bring that up about, some people will go to their primary care doctor first. In kind of advocating for this program, I came up against a statistic from 2013 that said just under 70% of children who need mental health treatment will not get mental health treatment outside of their primary care office, meaning that they never make it to a kind of, outpatient mental health facility. And so I think that in itself tells us that this system is very siloed. It's very broken. There's not been a lot of connection between it. And that's really kind of what we're hoping to do. Partnerships between different community partners. We're trying to connect all of these dots to keep all these pieces moving together instead of, okay, well, this is my area, this is your area, you don't come over here. It reminded me a lot of my brother and I when we used to fight in my parents' car back when we were growing up. We kind of had the dividing line down the middle, and that's traditionally how kind of mental health and medical services have been. They've been two completely separate things, even though we've known for about 40 years now that method of treatment is really ineffective. And so we are trying to do better with our partnerships and creating those opportunities. So outpatient services is definitely something that we can be better at.
So you want to take the tape off of the floor in the bedroom. That's what my brothers did. So.
I was always bigger than my brother, so that helped too.
So was mine. Okay, so does anybody have anything else to add on that before we change topics again? Okay, so what are some of the key signs and symptoms that everyone in the community should be looking for when we're talking about suicide and suicide ideation? What are the signs and symptoms that we should be looking for, and then how should we respond?
I think changes in behavior for sure, and that can be tricky too because, with my depression, I was that way for 14 years, and then the day that I was planning on taking my life, I woke up that morning and I was in a good mood and telling everyone goodbye because I knew that I was going to die that day, and I had made peace with the fact. But my husband at the time picked up on that and thought, "Whoa, this is different. She's acting a lot different." And thankfully, he picked up on that and went to work. And then he said, I thought about it on the way home, and he had turned around and found me in the bathtub when I had my attempt. So it can be tricky, but I didn't even think I was behaving that way. I just knew that I had made peace with it. So I think change in behavior is a big one.
I would say be aware of, one thing that I talk to a lot of patients about is to be aware of how your friend, family member, whatever, is thinking. A lot of times we're aware of how people might be feeling, but one of the things for me that I really pick up on, and maybe it's the kind of worldview that I have in terms of how I do treatment, but when I hear people start making these very black and white negative type statements where they take the viewpoint of I'm either good or I'm bad, right? It's like I either do something perfect or I'm terrible. And whenever I hear that sort of thinking, the cognitive behavioral person inside of me, what that does is that triggers me to start thinking, okay, this is a person who's really expressing a lot of irrational thinking. And irrational thinking will a lot of times then continue on to irrational emotion and irrational behavior. And that's one of those things I look for, is those kind of all or nothing, black and white type of statements where something is either good or bad, there's no in between. Usually when they start making those statements about themselves in the negative direction, that's when I need to start tuning in and paying very close attention.
Things like giving away important items, if we just look at really traditional research and what we see, like giving away significant items is something that you really want to look for. A goodbye that's different. And really it just gets back to the change in behavior. And that's not only just this down and out despair. It can be hopeless, it can be all of those things, or it can be this new sense of freedom that we've not known this person to have before or for a very long time. So it's really just knowing that your loved one, friend, colleague, whoever is just acting different.
Okay, so is there anything different from what you guys had each said? Anything different that you should look for with kids? Right? Because kids are sort of in this, right, they're growing and changing all the time, and they might be this way this week, and next week they might be completely different. Is there any different set of triggers? And what's just normal growth and development?
I think that's the confusing part sometimes as a parent. What's puberty and what's, depression, or, that's hard for me as a parent. You have a 16-year-old son right now that's been going through some stuff. And I think just sitting down, what I've done with him is just sit down and talk to him and really try to get to the core of what the issue is. And it's hard. It's hard with kids. You probably speak better about youth than me.
We would still look for all of the same, you would still look for all of the same changes in behavior that we've been talking about. I did pull up some specifics. If anybody has anything else, we can keep talking while I
was
pull
trying
them
to
up.
remember. I don't remember a young person leaving a note. suicide is typically more impulsive because they are more impulsive at that age. And it's more just a spur of the moment, something triggers and they act before they can think it through. And so I think with young people, they're much more prone to just an impulsive act.
Which is why it's so critical to not have the mentality of, oh, it's just a phase, even with kids who are going through puberty or whatever. That's why it's more important, because we know brain development is not where it will be, and problem-solving, decision-making, very much impulsivity is a big concern with this age. But as I look through the statistics, it's all the same things that we're talking about across the lifespan: feeling unimportant, hopeless, all alone, irritable, impulsivity, not caring about the future, putting themselves down. These are all common things that we're hearing across the lifespan. Saying goodbye to important people. And that's probably not like, hey, I'm thinking of ending my life today. It's probably like, I want you to know how much you've meant to me. Just a different kind of a goodbye than usual. Let's not forget in this conversation substance use. And it's, we don't want to only, if we're talking trauma-aware, trauma-informed, we know that when we use substances, there's something else going on. Usually, we don't just use substances to use substances. So if that's the case, when substances are involved and we have a young brain that's not fully developed and more impulsive, higher risk there. So giving away items, losing interest. This is a really important one. So let's say that you have a youth that loves to game or loves to play sports, and all of a sudden or over time, they're like, I just don't care about that as much anymore. That, coupled with several other factors, would be concerning, and that's across the lifespan. If someone loves to read, they love to watch TV, and now they just can't get anything out of that. That's a change, right? So you just have to apply that same thought across all of your own situations of, is there a significant change here in the person that we care about?
So what about, is there a difference between a loss of interest that's replaced by something else? So I used to love to read and now I like to watch TV. Is that something that should be throw up a red flag, or
that's
no?
Still interest. As long as we can find interest in something, interests usually change. But if we're like, that was always my go-to, and now that's not helping. Whenever I feel anxious or sad or lonely, that's when we're concerned.
And another thing I would say too in relation to thinking is, one thing that I hear from kids a lot is if they have something happen at school, like they do poorly on a test, or they get in trouble at school and they make a comment and they say something like, oh, I'm just no good. And a lot of times as parents, what I hear from, and I shouldn't say that as parents, but one of the things that I hear a lot from the parents of kids that I work with is they'll just immediately turn around to the child and say, oh, you're just being silly. And again, we get down to, the way that we talk to people creates that invalidating environment. I would argue, and again, maybe this is just going back to the cognitive behavioral part of my training, but, I'd argue that child doesn't just learn to say things like, I'm no good. There's some sort of belief in them as a result of what's happened that makes them kind of think that might be true. And when we just downplay it or we play it off and say things like, oh, you're just being silly, or, you don't really mean that, that starts that kind of invalidating environment. So again, pay attention to those sorts of statements. When something is, I've done really well in school up to this point, and then I had a bad day and all of a sudden I'm a terrible person, that's a change that we need to pay attention to.
Okay, I need one of you guys to be very specific here. We've had a couple of questions on this. If someone comes in and tells me, right, not one of you guys that is trained and an expert, comes and says, I'm thinking about suicide, how should that person respond specifically?
I think this is where community resources comes in real handy. So you might not know anything else. You might know, I'm trying to think of I'm Burrell, so of course I'm going to say Burrell. So I'm not trying to express bias here, but let's say I know that Burrell is a mental health system here. I'm going to say to that person, okay, I'm going to validate, and we're saying this a lot, validation, invalidation. If you could learn to validate, if all of us in society could learn to validate, we would have a lot better outcomes with mental health and wellness. So I'm going to validate, which means I'm going to reflect to the person that I understand what they're saying, or I'm trying to understand what they're saying. And then I'm going to say, I know this is where we can at least start. So maybe it is my medical health provider, maybe it's Borough Behavioral Health, maybe it's any other mental health system in this city. I'm going to get online and look up therapist, or any place that you call and you say, this is what I have going on. They're going to say, okay, this is a crisis line. Please call Mercy, please call Jordan Valley, please call Cox Health. Connect the people, get connected with people that can direct you. You don't have to have the answers. Use the resources that we have available, and if you don't know where to find them, start anywhere.
Something that we typically ask too is, do you have a plan? You know, what that usually kind of indicates how far they are in that process and how we need to gauge the situation. I mean, it's serious any way you look at it, but do you have a plan is what we generally ask right off the bat.
Is that okay for someone that hasn't had training to ask before?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're the doctors.
I think so. I mean, it's going to be, for somebody who's not trained, and in truth, if I can be, you asked for being very specific, I'll be very honest with you. When I have patients that are in the hospital and they tell me, I'm still thinking about hurting myself, it's still scary for me too. I mean, I want to kind of remove this idea that, well, I'm trained, and anytime they say that to me, it doesn't worry me anymore. It still worries me. It still scares me. I still want to get that person help. And so the other thing that I would say, as again, since we are all kind of frontline people in this, most all of us now have some sort of a cell phone that has some sort of a memory or auto save or whatever on it. You know, there are national suicide hotlines. There are local suicide hotlines. There are resources that you can just save the number in your phone. And if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I've been having some of these thoughts, talk to them. And in the midst of that conversation, ask if it'd be okay. A lot of times when those people come to you and they express, hey, I'm thinking about this, if you talk to them and you demonstrate to them that you're going to validate that you're going to be open to that conversation, you know, ask them, hey, would it be okay if we called this crisis line together, and I'm going to right here with you, and we're going to call together, because I don't want you to feel alone when you go through this process. There is no reason why we can't have these hotline numbers just saved on our phone for use when we need them.
Okay, thank you. So hopefully that helps us all put something in our tool belt, right? So that if this does come up, we have some responses. Validation, calling on resources, continuing to have a conversation with them, whether or not they have a plan. And this kind of leads into another question that we got. So when you see something, so social media is an interesting animal, right? And this question is, if you see posts on Facebook that they're thinking about suicide, how do you tell whether or not they're just trying to seek attention or when they're serious? And is there a clear way to determine that, or do you treat them all as serious?
Treat them all as serious. Yep. That was my example when I was in Jefferson City. I called 911 and asked for a well check based on a Facebook post. And I would do it again 1,000 times with no hesitation. I would rather be wrong 1,000 times than whatever the opposite of that is the other time.
Which is
Is that right?
I don't want to say right, but that'd be the opposite.
Right. You'd rather take the conservative approach.
Yeah.
Right.
That might be another thing that we could talk about too, are the well person checks. I think that's something that we might just think is easy to do, and it can be really easy to do. We call 911, say that we're concerned about someone. They're going to ask you some general information. So when you're talking, if you're not directly with the person that's expressing these concerns to you, you do want to ask those questions too. Where are you right now? And not because I'm going to send the cops after you. Just ask, well, where are you? Are you at home right now? Try to figure out where they are. Because when you do call for that well person check, they're going to want to know how to get to the person.
Okay. So another question from the audience, and I don't have a nice transition to this one. So you guys didn't team me up quite as well on this one. So when a family has a history, there's a family history of suicide, is there any sort of key factors, such as brain chemistry or just the way their mind's wired, right, that is different than the general population?
I would like to know the answer to that.
I don't know that I've seen research that says there are brain chemical differences, or because there was a family history of a completed suicide that necessarily means that there is a suicide increased risk. Usually, at least the way that I've always kind of looked at it, is the increase in risk is usually attributed to some sort of family history of mental health issue that is kind of learned and passed down and things like that. So I don't know that it's, this person committed suicide and I'm directly related to them, so now I'm at an increased risk, only insofar as that tends to be related to shared social situations, shared, financial or familial situations and things like that. So I don't know that there's a correlation between the act. I think there's a correlation between the behavior and the sociology around the act.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so we've got time for one more question, and I've decided to make it this one. Through the whole conversation, I've heard a couple of things recurring, and we were talking about validating versus invalidating. We've talked about myths and stigma. You've used a lot of phrases that I think a lot of people in our community would probably not be used to, right, is a completed suicide, right? You talked about before crazy talk. So what can everyone here do to help reduce that stigma, to help reduce that fear around mental health, around suicide? What are a couple of things that either your pet peeve and you want to stay on a soapbox for a second, or you just see that's really common that is really detrimental to positive mental health?
I still get the stigma. I still do, because people will look at me and think that I don't have anything wrong. So, I went to an event one time, and I was standing at the NAMI booth, and this woman said to me, "I don't need your services, but my husband does. He's crazy." And I literally turned around, I looked at my boss, and I said, "I need just a minute." And I went in the bathroom and bawled my eyes out, because that's me. And that person didn't know, And so I think there's things like that, we see mass shootings or school shootings, and the very first things people will say is, "I bet they had a mental illness." And that's another thing that bothers me, because that statement will prevent someone from getting help. We know that people that have mental illness are less likely to commit a violent act, but more likely to have a violent act committed towards them. So, educate yourselves. That's, I think, something that I'm on my soapbox a lot about. My son and my daughter, they lived this with me. And I can remember him coming home from school one day and said, "Mom," one of my friends said, "Hey, your mom's crazy. I heard she didn't leave her home." And my son looked at him and said, "My mom is not crazy. She's just very sick." So I think not only educating ourselves, but our kids too. I think we have the opportunity to change the language and make a huge difference.
I think that speaks right in line with what I think is we need to be aware of the way that we talk to each other, the way that we treat each other. And I think the words that we use when they are just so broadly invalidating, people that we don't even intend to hear what we have said have heard what we have said. And even if they don't know us or they're not going to relate their treatment to us in any way, for them that becomes part of it. And I go back to it, it becomes part of that negative dialogue that they have with themselves. And, we create an invalidating environment. They rehearse that invalidating environment because they hear people around them talking in invalidating ways. And so it keeps them, going back to the idea of, I didn't see this coming. This was out of the blue. Again, I think it's not because people don't want other people to know. I think it's because they're afraid to come forward because of what they have heard, what they've heard other people talk about. There's a lot of things that, a lot of words that we used to use in other contexts to describe other situations that have really, we've moved away from. We don't use those words to describe situations anymore. And I think words like crazy and psycho, I think those are words that have to go away because we are apparently not capable of using them in any sort of germane way to creating a conversation. And I think the longer we continue to use them, the more invalidating the kind of fabric of our culture is going to become.
Successful, unsuccessful suicides, those are things that you want to be cautious of. Failed attempts, you know, we are already feeling like a huge failure and now we can't even complete suicide correctly. So again, it's all about language. The way that we talk about it and who's listening, if we're talking about specific detail, well, how'd they do it? You know, and then who's listening when we're talking about that? So it kind of sounds like we're talking about a couple of conflicting things. Talk about it and then kind of don't talk about it. But it's how we talk about it that's important. Absolutely talk about it. Let's just be sensitive in how we talk about it.
And listening to each other and getting to know people, and so you know if there are changes, and listening to what they're saying. And I know so many times we hear there's so much divisiveness right now, but just you hear things and you kind of half listen, but just don't really pay a lot of attention. But pay attention to the people you know and the people you interact with, and then you will know if there are changes, if something's different, if they suddenly isolate themselves or just start any of the things we talked about, giving things away, changes in behaviors. And a lot of times it's withdrawing because they feel that people think they are not, something's not right with them, so they'll withdraw away from what they used to be involved in, used to enjoy, and just watch out for each other.
And I think, Tom, you said something to me one time that I will never forget, and this was a long time ago, and Tom said, what I wish I could tell some of these folks is this is a permanent solution to what could be a very temporary problem.
Yeah, and that goes back to there are so many people that it's just impulsive. I cannot explain why an 18-year-old on the way to work pulls into a parking lot and shoots himself. I can't explain that.
No.
So I'll close it on this note, and it's something that I hope wraps up some of what you said and sort of that application that a few years ago I heard for the first time. I heard mental health and mental illness described as a chronic disease, and presented it as you wouldn't talk negatively about someone. You wouldn't tell someone to pull themselves up by the bootstraps if they had a heart attack, right? And they went into the hospital. Our community, our society's response is to have an outpouring of support for that individual and to help them and to visit them and to care for them. But we don't seem to do that with mental illness. And so I think that's one of the things that's really stuck in my head, and every interaction I have with someone and every conversation I have, I think, did I treat that differently than if that person had heart disease or had cancer? And to have that same sort of response of what you said, listening and responding and not building stigma and not judging. So I think that's something, hopefully that somewhat summarizes, at least as best I can, unless, Kurt, you've got something else to add.
Well, just to kind of echo that, one question that got asked a long time ago that we never really got a chance to circle back to was, if you're a healthcare provider, how do you treat somebody that comes into the hospital? And I think that's an excellent way of looking at it, is that if you're a healthcare provider or you work in any sort of helping profession and you had a patient come in who had cancer, who had some sort of heart condition, and you're going to be a very encouraging person and wanting them to get better and hoping that they succeed and wishing them well and doing all these things, why would we expect to treat somebody with mental illness differently? And that's really kind of what I would circle back to that question and say is, I don't know that you would treat them differently. I don't know that there would be any way to kind of talk to them differently or treat them. You still want to encourage them. You want to hope that they get better. You want to be responsive and validating for what they need. You wouldn't tell a person who, just had surgery and they rated their pain as, as one, really high, and you wouldn't say, okay, we'll get you something to treat that. And you have somebody that comes in with another issue and they rate their pain equally as high, and you'd say, oh, you're just making that up. I mean, you want to be responsive to the situation. So I kind of wrapping back to that question, going with what you're saying, is it is a chronic issue and it is an issue that we can treat, but we need to be encouraging and validating and all those other things we've talked about.
I'm so glad you said that, because my family isolated me. They thought by not coming around that would encourage me to try and get out. And I remember when my aunt had cancer, everyone was bringing casseroles and flowers and cards. I was alone and isolated, and that was the worst part for me, is feeling alienated. So I'm so glad you said that, because that's something that people really need to think about. It's no different.
Okay. With that concludes tonight's session. So don't forget, there's 2 more sessions. Next week we'll unpack solutions, and then the last week we will tackle grief. And also as a reminder, our panelists will be hanging around for a few minutes afterwards, that if you want to come and have a one-on-one conversation with them, they will be available, I hope, for at least a little while. And if you could, please help me in thanking them once again for volunteering their time.